patikimas, taupus ir stilingas šildymas bei vėsinimas visus metus. Sutaikin oras šilumos siurbliais.
Sveiki visi, čia Karo kambarys. Pradeda laidą ne Algis, o aš, Saldžiūnas. Kodėl? Todėl, kad pas mus šiandien svečias ypatingas, ir mes kalbėsime anglų kalbą, nors galėtumėm kalbėti jidiš arba hebrajų kalba, bet kadangi Algis jos nemoka, kalbėsime angliškai. Ir kalbėsime su, gal iš karto į anglų kalbą perinu, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Rakov. Welcome. I can introduce you as a senior researcher at Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. I can introduce you as the one who specializes in Russian policy in the Middle East. You also have credentials from INSS and other institutions you were presenting your work. But first of all, I think our viewers, most of all, are interested in another thing, that you have 20 years of experience in what is known as Modin, or Aman, which is Israeli military intelligence, correct?
Yes.
Can you tell us about yourself first? I introduced you as an officer, former officer, Israeli military intelligence. What can you tell us, if you can tell us anything at all, about your previous life, so to speak?
So I was born in Ukraine, in Odessa, in Soviet times, and when I was 13, in 1989, we repatriated to Israel, and for 35 years, 36 years already, I am an Israeli citizen. Mostly I'm an Israeli. Never been a Ukrainian citizen, only a Soviet one. And then I studied in Tel Aviv University, joined the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, Amman. I was there for more than 20 years. I dealt with several theaters. Almost with any issue the strategic intelligence officer has to deal with. International relations, Iran, Syria, and Palestinian theaters. So then I retired in 2018, and I decided, as Russians are our neighbors in the Middle East, in Syria, so it's a good topic to focus on Russia.
Not any longer, sorry to interrupt.
For a time being, they are still there, but I agree that they are much less important currently than they were 3 months ago. They are still speaking about some deal about these bases. We can talk about it later. And so afterwards, I joined several think tanks, INSS, JISS, and Edmond Center in Tel Aviv University. So I'm a think tank now.
Okay. Why Russia? Why Russian field, if you said that your theater of specialization, so to speak, Syria, Iran, Palestinians, is because they are so much interrelated, or is because your knowledge, specific knowledge about the Russia and Russians, how Russia operates in the Middle East at least?
So I thought that I have better skills to deal with this topic than other topics. I did study Arabic when I was young, but I must say that our organization was so big that most of the info was translated, so I didn't need to use my Arabic. But having Russian, I have some direct capability to understand this actor. It was stronger and stronger in the Middle East. There was a lot of interest at 2018 with this sector. So, and all the time I was interested with the big picture, and dealing with Russia gives you the global scent of the Middle Eastern politics.
It used to be, sorry to interrupt you, sorry.
No, it's just as we sit here in another lacquered table in Riyadh.
Yeah.
Lavrov and Rubio and the other counterparts are discussing Ukraine and the Middle East. So it's helpful.
I was wondering if you would mention that you were born in Odessa, and I for myself have Jewish blood, probably a drop of it, doesn't matter really, but I feel it when I'm in Jerusalem. I can feel it, so to speak. What do you feel, or what have you felt before about Ukraine before 2014, after you left Odessa, for instance? Have you thought about Ukraine at all? About Odessa, maybe city, has more relation to you rather than the country, because it was Soviet Union back then, right? Anyway, Soviet Ukraine. After 2014 and after 2022.
So I will say that when I was in Ukraine, I was until the age of 13. I remember that it was a Russian city, and the general feeling was that Ukrainian culture, everything Ukrainian, is something which is inferior to the Russians. This is the way Odessa worked. For instance, it was part of Ukraine, but there were only 2 schools that taught everything in Ukrainian. I was in one of those. One was in the city, one in the oblast.
Do you know Ukrainian language?
So I studied. I must say that the feeling, my personal feeling when I was studying, that why did my parents do such things to me to make me study math and physics in Ukrainian? Why do I have to study Pavlo Tychina and Lesya Ukrainka poems? But so I do understand. As my Arabic it diminished, but if I have to deal with Ukrainian language, I can understand. It is more difficult to me today, and most of the feelings were about the city, because Odessa, the citizens, they have this feeling of this. Local patriotism about Odessa, and my parents, all my family and their friends are speaking, Odessa, the great city of Odessa, and they had a lot of pity with what Putin is doing to Odessa. From time to time, I see the bombardments, that the historical parts of Odessa are being bombed, and it's a pity. And if I was Russian, I would be ashamed, because under the pretext of liberating the Russians of Ukraine, the Russians are destroying their cultural heritage in Odessa.
If you were a Russian, you wouldn't be ashamed, because they have no such feeling.
I suppose that there are people who are
some, yes.
It's more difficult to talk. And I remember in 2014, I was infuriated, because the feeling was that Putin is destroying, undermining the world order by invading Ukraine. And then I think there was a feeling that some normalization, until 2022, because in 2015 the Russians appeared in our neighborhood, and we had a chance to see them, and they seem to be people you can talk to, but in the hindsight, you understand that the fact that you can speak to regular people, to the Russians, to diplomats, to the officers, it doesn't say much about the course the country would take, because but I'm quite sure that even the Russian officers and the diplomats were surprised by 2022 invasion.
Were you? I mean, as an intelligence officer, even former intelligence officer, when did you get the idea that this is it, they're going to do it, they're going to invade? Because a lot of people said that in 2021 already. Other people did not believe until the 23rd of February 2022.
We have our history in Israel, and in 1973 there was a surprise in Yom Kippur War, the Judgment Day War. And what was the essence of the surprise? The Egyptians would stage something that would look like a drill, maneuver, and from the maneuver they went into a war. So in 2021, when there were news that the Americans discovered that Putin is going for a war, I was asking myself, is it true, or it's a Putin information warfare of the high level of deception? So I didn't want, in the hindsight, from today, I understand that I didn't want to believe that the Russians might do something like that. But I said, you cannot disregard 200,000 Russians on the border. So you have, when I was invited for discussions or consultations about the situation, I say, until several months before the invasion, I would say, I don't know what does he want. I know that he wants to pressure the West, but you cannot disregard the scenario that he's serious, because there are 200,000 people on the Ukrainian border. So I'm not sure, but you have to prepare yourself for this scenario. And it was difficult in Israel, because people would prefer to prepare to one scenario, the optimistic one, and they didn't prepare enough for the bad scenario. I was sure for 100% that they are going to invade, I must say, only in the last week.
Okay.
On the last week, I analyzed all the situation, all the information, especially after they've annexed DNR now, and I saw that there is no way that they will invade, and they will invade all of the Ukraine. It will not be only a small one, but for Israel it was too late to change anything, and for Ukraine, they most of them, I think.
Do you think your former colleagues knew of certainty that Russians are going to do it? Knew that means they had all the intelligence before their eyes that the Russians are going to do that? Do you think that Israelis knew before others, like the Americans?
And considering the fact that many an expert would, back in the day, would say that from the military standpoint it was completely impossible.
I think that there is a discourse among the Russia expert, especially military expert.
Yeah.
I'm more strategic level. I'm not dealing with the Russian military in the more strict definition, but they say that why didn't people believe the Russians are going to invade in this scale? Because they said, we look at Ukraine, the scale of the country, the scale of the mission, and we look the Russians dispersed along the border, and we cannot, if it happens, it's difficult to believe that they will succeed in their mission. So this was one of the issues. To your question, I think that they were looking at it the same position as me. It's not intelligence agencies, they have to prioritize their collection. Israel is focused on the Middle East to have enough enemies. And as you know, in the last 2 years, we were prioritizing too much in Gaza Strip. But Russia, we don't deal with it directly. It's not a big secret. So I suppose we've got information from our partners in other places, but what's going on in the head of Mr. Putin, this is the big question. And I was, even before the war, I remember that I've written that you see the soldiers, you see the proclamation, you see American intelligence, but you do not see what's going on in the head of Putin, whether he wants to only to play with us and to extract as much as he can, and then to stop it or not. And in this regard, I must say that many people in Moscow, at that time, I had professional connections with think tankers in Moscow, and I was a little bit after the war. I was speaking to them, and senior people who said, I don't know, the Russian senior think tankers say, I don't know who, I don't know what, but nobody I know, the Russians said to me, predicted that we are going to invade in Ukraine, because people in Moscow didn't believe it.
All right.
But they did. They eventually did. A lot of things changed. And for Ukraine, obviously, for Europe, obviously, for Russia, obviously, also for Israel. Now, Russia's entanglement in Ukraine, drawing up forces, resources, meant that they did not have enough resources to keep other places, among them in Syria, working with Hamas, working with Hezbollah. Now, the question is, I guess for me to you, is Russia for Israel today, what is it? Is it still the same? Because referring to Algi's question, it's, Russia is no longer there. But it's still there in some capacity, but nonetheless, Hezbollah and Hamas are defeated, but not gone. Syrian regime has been defeated, but you never know what's going to rise from that regime, and we can split the answer into several questions. But how does that affect Israel, this whole situation that Russia has created, and it had a fallout on itself, and Israel used its chances to strike at Hamas and Hezbollah. Obviously, Hamas struck first. Nonetheless, it destroyed at least a large capacity of its enemies, which has had a lot of support from Russia. So what is Russia today for Israel in that retrospect?
Russia today.
Russia today.
I will have to answer on two levels. One level, what I think what Russia is, and the other issue is what the Israeli decision makers think of Russia. So I think that I will start with the later. I think that there is many people in the Israeli establishment look at Russia still as a great power or a big country with global presence, global capability to inflict damage, and therefore there is no will to pick a fight with Russia as long as we have much more intense problems to deal with. And also there are some options to which I think that they get more and more narrow to make Russia do something useful for Israel. But in general, I think the general feeling among the decision makers is that Russia is weaker. It's not that weak to disregard, but Russia is weaker. We are not part of Russia's camp. We are part of an opposite camp of Western camp. This is the way we view, where it was emphasized after October 7th, when the Russians embraced the crisis and acted unilaterally against Israel. And despite the fact that they made their rhetorics milder, Israelis do not forget it, not the regular Israelis, not the politicians. When I try to analyze Russia, so I also don't think that Russia is. I don't think Russia is 10 feet tall. I see a lot of weaknesses it has. We see one of the reasons this Assad regime collapsed is one of these weaknesses, as you mentioned. They have other weaknesses, both which are emphasized in the Caucasus with Armenia and Azerbaijan, in wider Soviet Union elsewhere, and they have problem of don't have enough energies besides Ukraine to deal with global politics. Therefore, most of the Russian activity in the more distant theaters are made by the propagandists and special services, which are, it's a cheap power projection. It's more difficult to project power. So I think for me, Russia currently is a source of many problems Israel have because some of the problems are produced by it intentionally to be a negative lever against Israel, such as this disinformation campaign in Israel, and some are problems that Russia, maybe it would not like to be there, but it has to work with Iran, it has to support it, it has to work with the rogue organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis, because they became its natural allies.
Is then Russia more dangerous today than it used to be several years ago? Consider the thought that Iran is now shooting ballistic missiles towards Israel. It would never do that several years ago directly from Iran. Yemenis, Houthis, are firing also missiles from there, all with Russian support, because there's nothing else for them to do. So are they stronger, or are they really that weak? Is that a sign of weakness? Is that a sign of something more sinister to come? That means Russians can eventually provide something that Israel feared or did not want for many years, the nuclear weapon, to the Iranians, maybe to the Houthis as well. Why not?
So I will say that what happened, because Russia became weaker, it had to deal with middle powers more intensively. And Iran is kind of a middle power. It's a big country, almost 100 million people, I think 80, something like this.
Iran, it's 80 million.
80 million. So it's big. It's big. It's strong because since its establishment in the 79, they were isolated, and in order to survive, they've built the vast defense industry. So the fact was that, as you probably know well, the Russia became dependent in 2022 on the supply of Iranian weapons. And for people like me who followed Russia for many years, and for the Middle Eastern analysts and for the Middle Easterners themselves, it was a surprise to what level did Russia, what level of weakness did Russia reach that it needed to ask the Egyptians for engines and the Iranians for
And yet
drones.
you say that Israeli decision makers, they still regard Russia somewhat as a great power, despite its weaknesses.
Yes.
So when you say that, and decision makers, by the way, do you mean the Netanyahu or broader sense, all the Israeli opposition
I say the broader political, strategic.
So it's not
leadership.
Netanyahu's sort of a thing that he's an obstacle, because we all know in Lithuania that Netanyahu is a, well, let's just say controversial figure, right? He would go to Moscow with the St. Georgian ribbon, which is banned in Ukraine and in Lithuania as well, because of what it represents. And he would do that for the sake of Israel. He would make a deal with the devil. Netanyahu would make a deal with the devil if it only serves, well, some say his own interests first, and then Israel's interests second.
So if we look at the continuum of the Israeli leadership, so we had Netanyahu since 2009 until 2021, and then Naftali Bennett was the next prime minister, and then Lapid, and then again Netanyahu. So Bennett was very, very similar to Netanyahu. One of the first his foreign trips was to Sochi, and he had 5 hours of talk with Putin, a cordial one, and therefore his choice at the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was to try to mediate. So he was not very different than Netanyahu because, afterwards, in the interviews, after he left Prime Minister's office, he still was treating Russia as a great power. And Yair Lapid, who was the next Prime Minister for half a year, he was much more critical of Russia, but still, essentially, it's about tonality. The tonality has changed. It was more critical, but the essence of the relationship between Russia and Israel, even during his time, didn't change because there were most important issues for the Israeli decision makers at that time was Syria. So that we don't have direct clash with the Russians in Syria. Iran, that the Russians will not be supportive of Iran enough. And there was a fear that Russians might retaliate against Israel through the Russian Jews. So these issues kept the Israelis not to get to open rupture with Russia, and since 2022 until now, the relationship most of the time were squeezing the positive part of the positive agenda, something useful to get from Russia was...
What possibly sort of a positive can you have from Russia, Israel, I mean?
So I will say until 21, in the end of 21, I together with our former ambassador in Kiev and in Russia, Tzvi Magen, we've compiled a book of articles, volume of articles about 30 years of Russian-Israeli relationship. And it seemed, and we looked at the economic domain, cultural domain, military and political, and etc. And it seemed that in 21, the cup was full. So we had relatively a lot of economic cooperation, trade, exchange. Tourism was booming. There was cultural exchange because many people of post-Soviet origin were consuming Russian culture. The Russians were helping to contain Iran at least. So they Israelis expected the Russians to help to drive Iran away from our borders, but they were helpful. They were thinking to contain, and they were not interfering in Syria. So and now the trade is much smaller, and everything which were I don't know what will happen after the rapprochement between Trump and Putin. But until now, it's difficult to organize anything commercial with the Russians because people fear sanctions, and there are a lot of troubles in financial sector. You cannot transfer the money, so much less positive to do with Russia, and people mostly will not initiate new things. On the cultural domain, also everything became politicized. So in the past, Russian theater will come to Tel Aviv and Israeli cultural activities, and it will go on cultural. But now, when somebody comes from Russia, everything becomes political. Should Israel give opportunity for the Russians come? And the people who come from Russia, in Russia, when they're active in their cultural life, it is also politicized. So it's almost nothing happens there. There are some, but it's a fraction of what was going on before. And in the past, we had, for instance, very important aspect of Israeli-Russian relationship was the remembrance of World War II, and the Israelis were dealing with the issue. They were grateful for the liberation of concentration camps and defeat of Nazi Germany. But this issue is also being politicized with Russian Foreign Ministry trying to take over Holocaust with the Maria Zakharova. She makes reports about that Holocaust is nothing to do with Jews, it's a Holocaust of the Soviet people. So everything possible,
That's
positive.
blasphemy, actually. That's
Yes.
a blasphemy.
Colonel, let's be honest here. I mean, we don't have to sugarcoat this. And this is probably my other question before I had another question. But do you think, would you go there to call Russia a fascist state today, considering what it is doing for us here? It is that's not a pressure, but it's just a statement. For us, Russia is a fascist state. For Ukrainians, as may sound, it is a fascist state. It not only attacked, it used the Nazi methods, stealing children, killing, butchering civilians, etc. This is what evil looks like. Would you say that?
I will say that fascism, nowadays it's labeling. Labeling an enemy, very much
who cares? You can label it.
Very much like Putin labels Zelensky as Nazi. I will say that it becomes more and more nationalistic, xenophobic, despite the fact that they try to portray themselves as friendship of the peoples, of Russian peoples, that became xenophobic, nationalistic, and pretty much like the Nazi state. It's the economy is controlled by the government, the corporative economy.
So what do you have as Israel to do with a pretty much Nazi state? What do you think?
I'm sorry to tell you, when inside the Israeli, and I have people like you inside of our strategic community discussing, and I remember the discussion saying what do we have to do with Russia? Why
Israel,
do we have to talk to it with
almost Nazi state?
But the problem is that in our neighborhood we are speaking.
Dar galingesnės, išmanesnės, efektyvesnės. Daikin Emūra. Čia susitinka tyla ir oro kokybė.